Anybody recognize any of those imagery or any of those stories in the video today? Anybody? All right, okay. Maybe we're going to bring you back a little bit to your Sunday school era, your Sunday school days. I know for me, I grew up in the church. My dad was a pastor. My mom was a pastor's wife, which meant she played the organ. And so that's just the way that stuff works, I think. But let's see if you kind of jog your memory a little bit, maybe some of your childhood memory or you as a parent. How many of you remember, we'll start off easy. Anybody remember this one right here? Some Veggie Tales? Maybe we've got a little bit of some trauma from the Veggie Tales, I never quite understood why the asparagus was so smart. Like, is that the smartest of all vegetables? And then there's always the argument that tomatoes are actually fruit, right? But whatever, we'll move on beyond that. Now, this is one of my favorites. Not quite my all-time favorite, but one of them was McGee and Me. Anybody remember the show or the movie McGee and Me? It was put out by Focus on the Family. I see that hand. Thank you. That means you and I we probably went to the same church and borrowed it from the church library. That was back in the day before Netflix existed. McGee and Me was this kind of like Mary Poppins-esque type thing where you was like live action, but then they would overlay this little cartoon character named McGee, and they went through all these adventures together. It was such a great time in my life, but nothing beat Hanna-Barbera's greatest Bible adventure, right? We've got these three. Is this jog anybody's memory? If so, man, you and I are tracking in the same wavelength. We may have even went to the same church. But go back, find this on YouTube. This is one of the best. 3 archaeologists. It starts out the same every time. 3 archaeologists set out on an adventure. And then this whirlwind stirs up, and they're always digging in sand, and then they're transported back in time to view and kind of look in on some of the Bible's greatest adventures, hence the name. Now, maybe you grew up in a family that didn't have television, or you weren't allowed to watch television, or some of those types of things, and yet you were allowed to listen to music. Anybody? Steve Green? The OG right there of kids music. Hide 'Em in Your Heart. Like this is some of those basic Sunday school songs were found with Steve Green's Hide 'Em in Your Heart, or if you're really digging deep, Psalty, the singing songbook, okay? This was a hymnal brought to life to make it really fun for us kids. We're gonna listen to Psalty, the hymn book. Come on, this is a great time, okay? This is what kids do for fun back in the early 80s. My family had it on vinyl, so we would throw it on the record player and listen to Psalty sing from the hymnal. Not quite hymns, but all of that kind of stuff. But these things are treasures from a day gone by, okay? Right? They all point back to this time in Sunday school, and it was an epic period of time in our lives when you know what? You'd gather together with a bunch of other rambunctious fifth graders, and it was always one crotchety old lady. It was just this one lady who probably hated kids, but still was the Sunday school teacher for all of eternity, okay? Nobody ever said, hey, you know what? I think you'd be best served folding bulletins. But they stuck her with fifth graders, and she did what? She taught fifth graders the Bible. In fact, when you think of Sunday school, some of you might think of this little school desk, and that may be one of the most appropriate images that you have. Because in Sunday school, we were the most important thing was to drill information into people. And it was we're going to teach you all about God. It's important to know about God. And so what did we do? We did crafts and worksheets, and we would play Bible trivia games and every other kind of creative thing to help us learn more about God. Now, I need to pause here and say I am so grateful for ladies like Mrs. Bartram and Mrs. McGuire and many other people who poured into my own life, heroes in the faith who poured into my life. And they laid a biblical foundation for where I'm at today, and many of you would say the same thing. You would say it was in those times of Sunday school where I learned some of the greatest truths. And, as a kid, I would wake up on a Sunday morning. Like I said, my dad was a pastor, and my mom was the organist or the piano player, and so they'd have to get there early. And it's basically I was the original roadie, right? So just like our church here today, we got people that show up early in the morning to make this happen. That was me, and so I'd have to get ready before they got ready. And so I would watch on like one of the 3 stations that we had on that old analog TV. I would watch Davy and Goliath. This was the Christian version of Gumby, okay? So it was claymation, and Davy and Goliath was the dog, and they'd find all kinds of trouble to get into, and then they would learn all of these new lessons. Or maybe some of you would resonate with this one, because, as an eight-year-old, I don't know why I continued to watch this, other than probably nothing else on, was Robert Schuller's Hour of Power, okay? From the Crystal Cathedral. Nothing quite like it for a solid 8-year-old boy to really capture his attention right before I headed off to my own church experience. And I'm trying to think, like, can I bring that robe back? I'm not sure, but maybe that'll be next week. You'll have to show up and find out. But like I said, I loved my childhood. I loved Sunday school. But there was something about all of this time in my life where it felt just very educational, very informational, and yet not quite so transformational. It wasn't showing up in the way that I lived my life. Now, is that the Sunday school teacher's fault? No, absolutely not. But there is something to be said about that we kind of put things in a box. We put Sunday school in a box and we say, all you really need to do is know more stuff. Just if we can get more of the Bible, into you, that will be good. We will be doing really well. Well, in the next 4 weeks here in our Sunday School Remix, we're going to be diving into 4 Sunday school stories that you probably know, but we're going to be asking the question of, God, what do you have to say to me today from what I learned yesterday? My prayer is that over the next 4 weeks, as we look at this, as we look at some of the things that you learned as a kid, that God's word will come alive in your life in a way that it hasn't before today. And that God's stories will become more than just tall tales to you. And in fact, that his stories, his words, will impact your story and change the direction of your life. See, as I alluded to, one of the issues that I faced as a kid was that I learned about the greatest heroes of our faith, right? I learned about Samson and how strong he was, and Queen Esther and David and Moses and Pharaoh. And I looked at these men, these women, and I'm like, man, obviously God only uses the really strong or the really successful people. And I started to put myself into a box, into a category that said, I'm nothing like those people, like those great heroes of faith. That doesn't really accurately represent me. And so, God, what could your plan be for my life? And this is just me speaking as a 12-year-old boy. But if we're honest, I think that many of us carry into our adulthood some of these very same thoughts. You may have even shown up here at Hope City and been like, listen, it's great that you believe that. It's great that you read that, and that's what God's word says, but I don't see myself in that. Like, I don't see myself as an Old Testament, New Testament hero. I don't see myself as even being possibly used by God. Well, today, one of the Sunday school stories that you have probably learned, we're going to learn that God not only can he use anybody, but God can use us when we've already made our own plans. We've made our own plans as to how life is going to go for us. We've made our own thoughts and opinions of the trajectory of our own life, and he can change that in an instant, and he can use us to leave his mark on this world in ways that we never could have imagined. So, to help us really get into the Sunday school motif, we're gonna go back to the original iPad, and we're gonna go to the flannel graph board. Anybody teach from a flannel graph? Anybody? Okay, yeah, a few of you. That's awesome. I had a kid earlier today, was a teenager actually, came up to the stage after we did a little preview service for our volunteers. He came up to the stage and he was like, he just wanted to touch it, like, what is that magical thing, right? Like, what is that device you have? Where is the power cord? Like, I don't see it, right? Like, really, really kind of funny, actually. But, as we think about this stuff, and we're going to use this in just a second to illustrate that, many of us find ourselves saying that we find ourselves trapped by 3 B's, really. When we say, God, I don't know if you'll ever use me, because I feel like you might use me if only I was a little bit better. Right? So the first B is, if only I was just a little bit better, God, you might use me. Because, I'm not quite, got everything in line. I don't have my whole life together. And God, I think maybe I just need to get better. Some of you would say, but there's somebody that's bigger than me, and so God's going to use the person that's bigger. And that second B sort of plagues you because that person's stronger. They have a bigger bankroll, or they have a bigger opportunity than you. And we start minimizing ourselves because we've maximized somebody else in our minds. And so we throw our hands up and say, God, obviously you can't use me. And then the last B that I think many of us fall prey to is that it's just not believable. We would say, God, it's not believable for you to use somebody like me, right? Like somebody who's in recovery, or, I've been divorced, or I'm pretty sure that, I don't know if I even like my kids right now. And so, we end up asking the question of, can I make a difference for God? And do I matter to God? I think that we tend to overestimate what can be done in a day, and we underestimate what God can do in a lifetime of experiences. We think that if I was better, bigger, or more believable, then God would want to use me. And see, this guy by the name of Gideon, he comes on the scene, and in fact, not just any scene, he's not on the water, and that's the beauty of flannel graph, is all of a sudden Gideon is transported to the ancient Israel hillside out there in the desert. This is Gideon. Gideon looks to be about 4,000 feet tall in comparison to the surroundings, but we'll let that go. Gideon is a man that God used in some incredible ways, even though this guy had his own plan. Gideon had his own agenda, his own idea of what he was going to do. So the nation of Israel, we're going to set the scene here in a second, is the nation of Israel finds themselves in a whole lot of trouble. Look with me at what's happening in Judges chapter 6, verse 1. He says, again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. This was kind of a pattern that they had. The nation of Israel would get themselves in trouble, and then they would cry out to God, oh, God, please save us. Again, they find themselves doing evil in the eyes of the Lord. And for 7 years, God gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in the mountains and in the strongholds. They would kind of find caves, and they lived in the mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, the Amalekites, and other eastern people invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep, nor cattle, nor donkeys. They came up with their own livestock and their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count the men and their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. And Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. We find Israel is all of a sudden saying, oh, God, what are you doing? Where are you? They would plant crops, right? And then the Midianites, they'd come in and they would camp in their midst, and they would destroy everything around them. And they would destroy everything that they had. And so the Israelites were frustrated, and they're like, God, where are you? And yet, see, they had a fractured relationship with God. What once was intimate and positive turned into something that was distant and kind of cold, something transactional rather than relational. Israel had wandered away from God, and God used a nation called Midian to bring them back to him. The Midianites, they swarmed in on the nation of Israel. Just like love bugs move into Florida in the spring and the fall, this is what it was like, right? I drove a car into the middle of Florida. This is an hour-and-a-half trip, and this is what the front of this car looked like, this poor car, right? This is only halfway. And I had to get home and scrape it all off. This is the kind of imagery of what the Midianites did to the nation of Israel. They came upon them in a swarm. They annihilated everything. But see, God not only heard their cry, he not only heard their pain, but he had a plan. And he sent an angelic messenger to deliver this plan to a guy right here that we find by the name of Gideon. Look at what this messenger says to Gideon. The angel of the Lord came, and he sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abizriite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you," catch this, "mighty warrior." Right? Here's the thing. Gideon is in an ancient wine press threshing wheat. This is what a picture of an ancient wine press it looks like a hole in the ground. Well, you would be accurately describing a wine press, okay? They just kind of carved a hole into the rock. When I was in Israel, I saw this and snapped this picture because they would mash up all the grapes, and then the juice would remain. They'd take off all the particles, and then they would scoop out all of that juice and turn it into wine. And this is where Gideon is threshing wheat. Well, our tour guide said to us, well, okay, so that's a wine press, but this is actually a threshing field. This is where you should be threshing wheat. You should be threshing this out in the open, out in the kind of in the center, away from the center of the square, because this is where the wind blows through, and it's going to take away all of the debris, and it's going to leave behind the really good kernels of wheat. So what you need to know is that a wine press was put in the center of several families. They all owned it together. And it was protected. It was highly valuable. It was desirable. And so it was in the middle. It was very, very poor placement to thresh wheat because none of the debris could fly away. It was all kind of surrounded by people. And this is where Gideon is doing this the job that's supposed to be done out in the open. He's doing it in secret and in private because he's afraid of the Midianites. He's afraid that the Amalekites are going to come in and swoop what little crop he has left and take that. See, Gideon finds himself in fear. And yet, the angel of the Lord said, look here, mighty warrior. Right? He said those two words. The Lord God turned to him and said, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go in the strength that you have and save Israel out of Midian's hands. And he asked this one very simple question. Am I not sending you? Gideon, am I not sending you? Because here's the deal. There's everything wrong with this scene. There's a young man who's threshing wheat in a wine press that doesn't make any sense, and he's saying, God, I don't think you could possibly use me. It's not believable. See, if you and I were making our own plans how to do this, how to save an entire nation, we probably wouldn't pick Gideon. And we probably would pick someone with a little more swagger than him, someone who's going to be willing to stand out and be like, listen, let's take Midian down. Like, we got this. Like, let's go save Israel. But let me ask you this question. If God is sending you, what's preventing you? If God is actually sending you to do something and you feel God tugging on your heart to do something, or maybe it's like, I feel like I should go talk to that neighbor, or I feel like I should, spend more time with that person at lunch, or I feel like I should, if God is sending you, what's preventing you? Like, what fear do you have? What one of those 3 B's is kind of holding you back? Why is it that when God sends us, we create excuses to prevent us? God gave Gideon a word, and I believe he has a word for us today. He says, go in the strength that you have. In other words, if we're going to follow God, we need to follow God right now. Not when we've got it all together, not when we've got like more money in the bank, not when we have more skills under our belt. No, he says, I want you to go today, go right now. In fact, point 1, if you're taking notes with us today, it's this, that we need to go with what God has given you. Gideon shows us, he reveals this to us from this ancient story, that we need to go with whatever God has put in your heart right now, whatever he's given you today. If you're wondering, like, how do I make a difference in this world? Or how do I leave my mark? Or if you started looking around the world and saying, man, something is wrong over here. Well, what has God given you that you could use for the good of others? What do you already have in your possession that you can use to impact and to bless other people around you? Maybe if you're a builder, right? Like if you build homes or you do some sort of finish work in homes, how could God potentially use your skills and your abilities that he's given you, not just to build buildings, but to help build into other people? What if you're building more than just a structure, but you're building a house that could be somebody's home, a family that's going to build into somebody's family or an entire community? Maybe you're a business owner. And you understand that God has actually given you the ability to make money. You're really good at making money. Well, what if your ability to make money, and God's given that to you so that you have an abundance of money to invest in God's work here and around the world? It's not wrong to make lots of money. It's wrong to hoard money and to grow in greed on, listen to this, any level, both small and large. That's when it turns into a problem. Or maybe you're a stay-at-home mom and you're just like, I'd love to be Gideon. I'd love to have some sort of mission, right? Well, hold on. Just because you're at home doesn't mean that you're not doing the work of the Lord. You might be doing the greatest task that God could ever set in front of you, and you just don't know it. What if your greatest contribution to this world is not what you do, but somebody that you're raising? See, you and I, we need to go with what God has given us. We make excuses too often because of what we don't have. But listen to me. God is not limited in what he can do through you because of what you feel is missing in you. God has given you everything you need, everything that he needs. And yet Gideon is just still not sure. He hears this, go in, you mighty warrior, and he's like, wait, hold up. Me? I mean, mighty warrior? I don't think so. Like, if you read the rest of the story, Gideon says, I'm like the lowest, the least, the last. I'm the smallest of my tribe, and my tribe is the most insignificant in this nation. And you want to use me? God, if you really want to use me, Gideon starts running these tests. He says, listen, God, if you want to use me, I'm going to ask that your messenger stays present with me so I can prepare a sacrifice. And then Gideon, what did he do? He put a sacrifice of a young goat and a lump of dough on a rock. And then the angel of the Lord touched the rock, and it erupted into fire, and the rock consumed the meat and the bread. And Gideon was moved. His heart was moved. He's like, oh my goodness, I'm in the Lord's presence. He says, but wait, I'm just still not sure. Does this sound like any of us in the room? Like, God's like, I want you to go. And you're like, I don't know. But I got to get a couple things in order before we do that. Well, this is Gideon. He goes, how about this? How about one more test, Lord? How about this? How about God, I'm going to put this fleece, I'm going to put my sweater outside, and what I want to have happen is I want you to make the fleece wet. So saturate the sweater, but all the ground is dry, okay? And guess what happened? Sweater was wet, ground is dry. And Gideon's like, well, that's pretty cool, but still not sure. So how about we do this a third time, God? And look at what happens. Gideon says to God for a third time, he says, he even kind of precludes, he goes, don't be angry, God. Like, I know this is frustrating. Don't be angry with me, right? Let me just make one more request. Before I go and do your thing, let me just ask one more thing of you, okay, right? Like, this time I want the fleece dry and the ground covered with dew. And that night, God did so. Only the fleece was dry and all the ground was covered with dew. It's so easy for us to get annoyed with Gideon, where we're like, stupid Gideon, why are you testing God? Right? Like, we think of that verse in Luke chapter 4, where Jesus says, he says, don't put the Lord your God to the test. And we're like, see, Gideon, you shouldn't put the Lord your God to the test. And yet all of us do it all the time. We're like, God, if you want me to, like, open up that parking space. Well, there's no parking space open, so guess I can't do it. Guess I can't share that. Or, God, if you want me to talk to my neighbor, like, please have them out in the front drive, like sitting on a lawn chair when I get home, and prepared to ask me a question, okay? Then I'll know you're calling me to talk to my neighbor. Like, what? Or like all these different things that we do. And yet, we can be frustrated with Gideon, and we do that very same thing in our own lives. But Gideon's story reveals to us an incredible point that you and I need to write down. We need to hang on to this. God's patience outlasts your weakness. Those things that you would get frustrated even with yourself, if we're really, really honest, like where nobody else is looking around, nobody is like looking at your notes, and nobody even maybe knows this about you. And you're frustrated with those things that you would say, man, if only, I was better, bigger, or more believable. God is so patient. He's not frustrated with your weakness. He's not saying like, man, when you get it together, then I'm really going to be able to use you. No. God is saying, I've already gifted you for this. And I'm a patient God, a God who understands humanity. He created you, and he wants something for you. Far more than he wants anything from you. If you don't hear anything else today, hear me say this, that God doesn't just want something from you. He wants something for you. He's given you these gifts because he wants you to experience the incredible nature of who God is. He wants you to experience all these different things. And so, like, what if the one thing that God was calling you to While, yes, it may be something that's being accomplished for the community, like Day for Hope, it's going to be incredible. It's going to bless our community in ways that you and I may never know. But what if serving at Day for Hope was actually, God wanted to use that to do something in you rather than just through you? I mean, is that possible? Too often I think we get confused and we mix up our plan with God's plan. Like saying, well, here's how it should shake down, God, right? Like, I've already determined how this is going to happen. And this is a little bit of what Gideon did. In fact, Gideon said, if we're going to defeat the Midianites, we're going to need a whole lot of men. And we're going to move these men because they're going to go to a different spot. We're going to go down by the river, down in a van by the river, right? And we're going to meet up all together. So let's get the entire nation together. And we're going to get as many men as possible. Approximately 32,000 men, the Bible tells us, showed up to fight the Midianites. So Gideon's like, all right, God, we can do this thing, right? Like, I can do what you're asking me to do. But what we need to do is we need to get a whole bunch of guys. So Gideon prepares them, he gets them all there, and they start devising a battle plan like any good army would do. And so then God says, wait a second. Look at this. He says, Gideon, you have too many men. Right? Like, who does this make sense to? Not Gideon for sure, not you and not me, because we're like, how do we defeat nations? Well, we send in the biggest, strongest, baddest army we can possibly find. You've got too many men for me to deliver Midian into their hands. In order that Israel might not boast against me and say that her own strength has saved her, announce now to the people, anybody who trembles or anyone who's fearful may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. Look at how many people left. 22,000 men left, leaving behind only 10,000 people, right? 22,000 men left because they were afraid. See, that doesn't look like a good plan, right? Gideon might be able to say, okay, cool. So 32,000 was a lot. So I think we're going to go in a little bit sneaky, a little stealthy, right? A little like covert ops. So we're going to go in with 10,000, right, God? And God goes, wait a second, hold on. The Lord said to Gideon, you still have too many men. Oh, come on. For the love of God, like, what are you talking about? He says, no, here's what I want you to do. Take them down to the water. And because this makes sense, right? Like, I'll sift them there for you. So Gideon took the men down to the water, and there the Lord told him, separate those who lap the water with their tongues like a dog from those who kneel down to drink. And 300 men lapped with their hands to their mouths, and all the rest got down on their knees to drink. If you and I are like Gideon, I'd be thinking like, so where's this like Israeli ninja warrior course? Like, we're going to figure out who the strongest of the strongest men are. We'll take the top 300 and we'll go, kick some Midianite butt. But God says, no, I just want to know how they drink. How do they drink water? Like, are they putting their face in the water or are they bringing it up to them? Like, what gives here, right? And all of a sudden, the Lord said, there's still too many men. Here's what we're going to do. When the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hand. Let all the other ones go. Let all these other guys go because they're not needed. But keep the 300 who took over the provisions and the trumpets and all the other stuff. Gideon went from 32,000 men to 300. And see, in God's providence, according to God's plan, not ours, 300 is greater than 32,000. And don't forget how they're chosen, right? All based upon how they drink water. This doesn't make any sense. God's plan was to use 300 men to defeat countless other men. If I'm Gideon, I'm saying like, God, why me? Why are we doing this? Like, this isn't going to work out. This isn't the plan that I thought. And frankly, some of you are experiencing that right now. You've got something in your life, like you see Midian camping off in the distance, and you thought that God said, here's what we're going to go do. And yet God says, there's too much in your life. There's too many things, too many people. You're going to boast on your own. Don't do that. And God starts taking away some of your plans, some of the ways that you thought it would happen. and by now, maybe you thought you'd be married by now, you'd have 2.5 kids by now, and you're living the American dream, and you're kind of looking at this and you're like, man, I feel a lot like Gideon because this isn't my plan and it's not working according to my plan. About 3 years ago, Tiffany and I set out to launch Hope City Church. How great is that picture, first off? And we had this plan of how we were going to launch the church, and God put a vision in our heart to serve this city, to be for Sarasota. We believe that the local church should be an anchor of hope in our community. And so we saw this, and we partnered with the ARC, the Association of Related Churches, which is a church planting network, to launch and plant this church here in Sarasota. And we went through an extensive interview process with them. They looked at our marriage. They looked at our finances. They looked at our relationship with our kids. They drilled us about everything before they gave us the green light to plant a church. Tiffany and I flew out to California to meet with this board, and before this interview, we went through some training and all these things. And on the very last day of that trip, the last meeting of that trip, I should say, we sat across the table from this one pastor who had interviewed us, and it was the moment of truth where he said, "Okay, yes or no, we're going to plant you, we're going to get behind you, or we're going to pass on this opportunity." And so we're sitting there, and I look across the table, and I said, "So tell us, when do you want to plant this church?" I said, "September, early September." And they go, "Okay." And he kind of looked down, and he came back up, and he goes, "Listen, we believe in you. We think your marriage is strong. We think that God has given you a vision for this church, but we think your timeline is off. We think it's too quick. We think that you won't be ready to launch this church in September." And I felt, I don't know that I've ever felt more like Gideon than in that moment, where I'm like, no way, you're wrong, you don't know what you're talking about, because listen, I need a job, okay? I need to be doing something. I need to bring some money up into this family, okay? And talk to me about payroll, okay? How do we do that for another 4 months? They go, "You know what, if you want to launch this church, we want to do that with you, but we think you need to wait till January." I said, I appreciate your feedback. Do you mind if I go lay a sweater out in the front yard? and I said, can I come back and give you an answer tomorrow? Because I need to think about this. I left there, and I think I pounded the dash of that rental car. Nothing parties like a rental. And I'm like, boom, angry, pulling the steering wheel off this thing because I'm so frustrated that my plan, God had other plans that went against my own plan. Tiffany, she is the most wise woman that I've ever encountered, and God has been so good to me by bringing her into my life. She looked at me and she said, "We swore to be the kind of leaders that we always wanted when we were being raised up. Why would we now not listen to the voice of wisdom from other people? Why would we not listen to what somebody else has to say?" And it was this moment where I'm like, but it's my plan. I've prayed about this. I believe this is when it's supposed to happen. And yet God was like, no, you've got too much. We're gonna do it a different way. Just send that home. Go back and tell everybody it's going to be another 4 months. And so the next morning we woke up and said, yeah, we're going to wait, because we want to follow what God's plan is over our own plan. So we had to learn a lesson, the same lesson that Gideon had to learn, and it's that God's plan is greater than your presumptions. There are things in your life that you have presumed that will be true, and yet God has an even greater plan than that. How could 300 be greater than 32,000? Well, it's because God's plan is greater than your presumptions. Gideon presumed he'd be swinging a sword, that he would be going on to show how powerful the nation of Israel was, and to redeem themselves in the face of all these surrounding nations. And spoiler alert, Gideon didn't swing a sword at all. In fact, those 300 men, do you know what they carried? They carried a clay pot with a torch inside of it, and they carried a trumpet. And at this one moment, God said, here's how you're going to do this. Surround the Midianite camp, and at the same moment, I want you to scream, we've got this thing, and it's going to be a sword for Gideon and for the Lord. And break the pot, and then the flame is being shown, and then I want you to blow on these trumpets as loud as possible. Cool, so we're going to defeat an entire nation with a horn and some fire? Like, what are you talking about, God? And then God does what only God can do. The entire camp turns on itself. They're in such confusion. It's like when a kid comes and wakes you up in the middle of the night. You're like, what's happening? Where's, like, who puked? Where are we going? What? Right? And then you're just like, you're elbowing your spouse and like, you're throwing punches. You're ready to bring it down. And this is what happens. God, the entire nation of Midian turns on itself, attacks itself. And Gideon never swings a single sword. And the battle is won. Because Gideon's plan he didn't push it through. He could have 100% said, no, God, we're going to take all 32,000, we're going to march in there, and we're going to start swinging. And he would have lost. Sometimes your plan, what you have presumed to be true, is not as strong as what God's plan is for your life. And so I'm telling you this, that God uses average people in average ways to have some above average results. But it's going to require that you and I just leave the outcome to him. So if you're a season of waiting or wondering, like, what in the world is God doing? Or maybe you're wondering what the plan is, let me remind you that God's plan is greater than your presumptions. God defeated the Midianites that day, and he worked through a man named Gideon. He can do it in your life as well. It was undeniable to the world around them. Actually, if you read Judges chapter 7, you're going to see that the nation of Midian already knew that this was happening. God gave them a dream, a vision. And they said that God, it's Gideon, and Gideon's God. There's no way, no military muscle, no significant strategy here. This was a move of God that could not be denied. And sometimes we miss out on the opportunity for God to reveal himself because we're so worried about our own plan and working that out. And I'm wondering, like, could you change the world? Could I change the world, make a difference in this community? Absolutely. But let me remind you of this one truth that we learned from Gideon, that God doesn't need greatness. He desires faithfulness. God can do more through a person's faithfulness than someone's skill. Skill will 100% of the time get noticed by man, but faithfulness gets used by God. Skill gets you put on a platform. Skill gets you put on a conference speaking like circuit. Skill gets you put like raised and elevated up in the organization. But God uses faithfulness to change people's lives. God created you and He's put you where you are on purpose. If you've got a pulse, you've got a purpose. And the last time I checked, every one of you in this room still has a pulse. God has a purpose for you. And what if that purpose was different than your presumptions? What if God's giving the abilities so that you would use those abilities, those efforts to serve other people? On July 20th, we're hosting Day for Hope here. And we're partnering with Tatum Ridge Elementary School and the families in need. And we're going to be honoring all these families and these students and helping them return back to school in a way that is going to set them up for another successful year of learning. And provide for them to have hope and say, you know what, we can do this. We're sponsoring these families with backpacks and school supplies and haircuts and medical exams and all these kinds of things, ultimately to care for their physical need, yes, but because we believe that we want to be able to pray with them and encourage them along the way and provide for their spiritual needs. So I can't think of a better way for you to jump out of your comfort zone and say, it may not be my plan, but I'm going to follow your plan, God, and to serve other people on July 20th. What if God has given you the ability to make money, or He's blessed you with money so that you can be generous with your money? Now, I'm not talking to just those who have a lot of money. This applies to every person in this room. Here at Hope City Church, we're a tithing church, which means that every year we give away at least 10% of whatever comes into this church through your offering, through your tithes. This goes to support new church plants or our community, people in need. And what if God is saying, I know it doesn't make sense for you in your mind, but I want you to be generous with your finances. Would you do it? Or what if God's given you the ability to host people in your home? I'm talking about inviting your friends and your neighbors and those that you work with to come over to your house and to have a dessert or a barbecue to share a meal together. Because everyone is looking for someone to love them. Could that be you? Someone to pay attention to them. Imagine the God-sized conversations you can have with others when you simply just acknowledge their presence and invite them into yours. Remember, God uses people in above average ways when they surrender the outcome to Him. What could God be doing through you as you step out of your comfort zone beyond your plans and you surrender it to Him?